Hello, and welcome to this talk about the British Museum and its collections. During the talk, I'm going to cover a number of areas, beginning with the origins and early development of the museum. And as I go through, I'll touch on how ideas about what museums are for and how they should be organised have changed. I'll also mention some practical issues. I'll introduce you to some of the less well-known galleries and objects and take you behind the scenes a little bit. And I'll finish the talk by discussing the newest gallery in the museum and the thinking and the work that went into developing that. I'm a volunteer at the museum, but I must emphasize that I'm here speaking in a personal capacity, and any opinions that I express are my own and not necessarily those of the museum. But let's begin with some background information. I'm sure most of you know that the British Museum is a very large institution and it holds about 8 million objects in total. In a normal year, we would receive about 6 million visitors, obviously not in 2020 because of repeated lockdowns. There are about 1,000 staff and more than 500 volunteers. And the museum is the largest neoclassical building in the British Isles, and I will be talking about how this building came into being as I go through the talk. I'll also mention different parts of it. So just to give you some orientation, up the left-hand side of the picture is the front of the museum where the two areas of lawn are, and that's Great Russell Street. To the right of the picture is the rear entrance of the museum, which goes out onto Montague Square. The most popular exhibition that the museum has held was in 1972, and it had 1.6 million visitors. And some of you may already have guessed what that exhibition was. It was the one devoted to Tutankhamun, and it was probably the first blockbuster exhibition anywhere. How did it all begin? With this man. This is Sir Hans Sloane. He was born in Northern Ireland. He trained as a doctor, and between 1687 and 1689, he went to Jamaica for 15 months, where he worked as physician to the governor. He described his job as, or his job has been described as, dealing with the effects of drinking amongst the whites and keeping the slaves fit to work. While he was in Jamaica, he started to collect botanical specimens, animals, and ethnographic items. And when he returned to the UK, he wrote, after a number of years, The Natural History of Jamaica. When he came back to London, he worked as a society doctor, and his patients were rich and influential people, and they included Queen Anne. Some of you might have seen the recent film, The Favourite, about Queen Anne. He also treated Samuel Pepys and John Locke, the philosopher. And he became fabulously wealthy. So he earned about £7,000 a year from his medical practice alone. And it's very difficult to translate money from the 18th century to the present day. But one website that I looked at estimates that that's roughly £800,000 a year. And he was able to charge a guinea an hour for a consultation. He married Elizabeth Rose, who was the widow of a plantation owner, and he received an additional £4,000 a year income from that. In other words, quite a lot of his income came from slavery. He also earned income from promoting chichona bark as treatment for malaria, and also he was able to, or he gave his name to the promotion of chocolate as a medicinal drink. And here you can see on the left, you've got the picture of the chichona bark, which is used to treat malaria. In the middle, you've got this rather charming advert. And on the right, you've got these three little cups, and these were cups which were specifically designed for drinking chocolate. Now, I mentioned that Sloane began collecting in Jamaica, and he carried on collecting when he came back to the UK. As I say, he was very wealthy. He bought Chelsea Manor to live in, and that was a house which was built for Henry VIII. He was made a baronet. He became secretary and then president of the Royal Society. And in his will, he offered his collection to the nation. And one of his motives for this was because he'd seen other people's collections broken up after their death, and he wanted to keep his collection intact. The nation was given a year to decide whether it wanted to buy the collection, and if not, it was then going to be offered to another, a series of other countries in turn. And the government decided they did want to buy his collection, and they set up a lottery to raise money to buy it. And that lottery raised a total of something like £95,000, again, a huge amount of money. And here you can see on the left a picture of the first British Museum. Now, you're probably looking at that and thinking, that's not the British Museum. It doesn't look anything like that. And the answer is, of course, the present one doesn't, but it started off in a completely different building. This was Montague House. It was bought for £10,250, but it cost more than that to refurbish it and to make it fit for purpose. And it was opened to the public on January the 15th, 1759. Initially, anybody could come to the museum, but you had to apply for a ticket to get in, and you were only allowed in for an hour, 10 people at a time, and you were escorted by one of the assistant keepers. And here you can see in the middle, we've got a picture of one of the tickets that was issued. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that people's ideas about what museums are for have changed over the years. And the original conception of the museum is very different to the one that we have now. So it was much wider than what we have now. It consisted of a library, and that was Sir Hans Sloane's library, but also the Royal Library, which was more than 10,000 volumes collected by monarchs from Henry VIII to Charles II, and the Contonian Library. And this was a private library built up by the Cotton family. And this included the Lindisfarne Gospels, 2 copies of the Magna Carta, a manuscript of Beowulf, and other treasures. In addition to the library, the museum held natural history specimens. Now, you can see in the picture on the left a number of giraffes, and they are at the top of one of the staircases. And you may say to yourself, well, I've never seen a giraffe in the British Museum. And of course, that's because they're no longer there. But interestingly, I went to a talk given by the archivist once, and she said there's no record in the archives of the museum ever holding any giraffes, but there is a record of us holding camels, and yet there are no camels among the specimens. So she thinks that these giraffes were actually mistaken for camels. So in addition to the library and the natural history specimens, the museum also held antiquities. So a very different institution from the one we have now. And as it says at the bottom there, the first director was actually the chief librarian, because the library was considered to be very important. Now, as soon as the museum opened, it grew very, very fast, and lots of people gave donations and acquisitions were made and so on. And I've just listed some of the important ones here. First of all, Sir William Hamilton, who was a great collector of antiquities, he gave his collection to the museum. And William Hamilton is perhaps best known as the husband of Lady Emma Hamilton, who of course was the lover of Horatio Nelson. In 1816, the museum acquired the Parthenon sculptures. Many donations were made, for example, from David Garrett, from Captain James Cook, Sir Joseph Banks, and so on. Lady Raffles donated Sir Stamford Raffles' Javanese collection, and the Bank of England donated coins and medals, and we have a gallery specifically devoted to coins and medals. George III was a great benefactor of the museum. and he donated many items, including items from the Napoleonic Wars and scientific instruments. Some of you may know that George III was very interested in science. And one of his most notable donations was the Rosetta Stone. And this is one of the most popular objects for visitors to the museum. As I'm sure you know, this stone was absolutely critical in the decipherment of ancient scripts. And the key to the decipherment is the fact that it's written in 3 languages, each of which says exactly the same thing. So at the top, you have Egyptian hieroglyphs, which was the language of the priests in ancient Egypt. In the center, you have Demotic Egyptian, which is the language of everyday transactions, and that is related to modern day Coptic. And at the bottom, you have ancient Greek, which was the language of the court administration, or what we would call the civil service. It's a decree from the Council of Priests about the king of the time, Ptolemy V. The Ptolemies were Greek in origin, which is why the business of the court was done in Greek. And the decipherment was done by an Englishman called the Reverend Young and by a Frenchman called Francois Champollion, who knew Coptic, which helped him in the decipherment. Now, I showed you a picture earlier of the original museum, Montague House. The collection very quickly outgrew that building. And the first expansion was the building of the King's Library, which is now the east wing of the museum. So as you go into the main entrance from Great Russell Street, it's on the right-hand side, and it's room 1 in the museum. It's now called the Enlightenment Gallery, and there's a picture of it there. And this was originally built to house King George III's library of 65,000 books and 30,000 pamphlets. And the architect was a man called Robert Smirke, and he built in the Greek revivalist style. He also was the architect for the Royal Opera House, and so if you think of the facade of the Royal Opera House, you can imagine that Greek revivalist style. You can't see them very well on this picture, but there are Corinthian columns, and the proportions are based on Greek proportions and so on. The room was completed in 1828, and the design was, to quote, supposed to be chaste, grand, and truly classical. And this was related to the beginning of a change in the function of the museum. Because what Sir Hans Sloane had aimed for in his collection was what we call universality. He wanted to represent all knowledge of the time, and he wanted the museum to be able to, quote, survey the whole of creation. And people, prior to the opening of the British Museum, which was actually the first non-secular national museum anywhere, people had built up private collections which were often known as cabinets of curiosities. And that name gives you a clue, because they were looking for unusual objects. Whereas in the 1820s, the museum was beginning to move towards a more scientific view, and to see the museum as a place of education and the development of knowledge and so on. But this first expansion was designed from the outside in. Nothing changes, because even then the curators were saying, well, it all looks very nice, but actually inside, it's not the best design for actually displaying the collection. After the East Wing was opened in 1828, the museum then built the West Wing and the North Wing. As you could see on that aerial photograph I showed you earlier, it is in the shape of a quadrangle. And then Montague House, the original building, was demolished, and the current main entrance was constructed. And here you can see the portico. So the next time you're able to go to the museum, do look up and have a look at this. Again, very neoclassical Greek, but the pediment shows the progress of civilization. So again, that is linked to the changing conception of the museum. The reading room, which has been closed for some time, very famous, was completed in 1857. And I'm sure that some of you know that it's had some very famous visitors. Most people know that Karl Marx used to go to the British Museum reading room. Fewer people know that Lenin also used to go under an assumed name, but it was also used by people like Oscar Wilde, Arthur Conan Doyle, Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, Virginia Woolf. And the museum in general was also visited by some famous people. Mozart went there in 1765. And Rodin visited frequently and was very inspired by the Parthenon sculptures. And a couple of years ago, we had a wonderful exhibition of Rodin sculptures, which were placed side by side with some of the Parthenon sculptures which had inspired him. And it was really interesting to see the dialogue between the different works. Van Gogh also went there when he lived in London for a year. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the museum very quickly outgrew the building, and the collection just continued to grow and grow. And some of it began to move to other specialist museums. So moving from Sir Hans Sloane's conception of universality, trying to cover everything, the museum began to become much more specialized. So the first to go was the Natural History Collection, and that moved to South Kensington in the 1880s into what is now the Natural History Museum. So Sir Hans Sloane's botanical collection is predominantly now in the Natural History Museum, as is Sir Joseph Banks. And it was quite an extraordinary undertaking. The items were moved by horse and cart. It took over 3 months, and it took almost 400 separate trips to transport everything down to South Kensington. The newspaper library was opened in 1903 to 4. Prior to that, the British Museum had held the National Collection of Newspapers. 1824, the National Gallery was opened. Again, the National Collection of paintings had been held by the British Museum until then. The Museum of Mankind, between 1970 and 1999, which is the ethnographic collection, was at that time in behind in Burlington Gardens, near where the Royal Academy is now. It came back to the museum in 1999, and it's now in what is called the Welcome Gallery, which is behind the Great Court in room 24. And the biggest, most recent change was that the British Library was opened on the Euston Road in 1999, and that freed up the reading room. And it was at this point that the Great Court was roofed over and turned into a public space, a huge public space. It covers 2 acres. And as it says there, it's got more than 3,000 glass roof panels. It takes 2 weeks to clean them. Chaps go up there with harnesses and safety ropes and so on and so forth. And we use it a lot for public events. On the right, you've got a picture of a piece which was made for the Mexican Day of the Dead. And I was volunteering on that day, and we had 30,000 visitors in the museum on one day. So you can imagine how crowded it was. Now that gives you some idea of the beginnings of the origin and the first changes which took place in the museum. But of course, as well as being a place of scholarship and learning, there are a lot of practical issues that have to be dealt with. To begin with, the museum was heated by open fires in the galleries. It opened its first refreshment room in 1866, and I've got a lovely quote here from the Civil Service Gazette describing the refreshment room. The princes of Thebes, lying in their perfumed coffins, are forgotten in the glories of roast beef. Isis and Sesostris vanished to oblivion before the more potent attraction of college pudding. The kings of Nineveh, engaged with frantic enthusiasm for the chase, fade from the memory in the vapory presence of boiled cabbage. Well, I'll leave you to decide whether that's true or not. Like most large buildings, like most large old buildings, one of the issues that the museum has to deal with is vermin. And we have a number of cats between 4 and 7, the most famous of which was Mike, who is pictured there, who used to guard the gates and who was, I believe, considered quite fierce. Because of the amount of paper in the museum, and if you remember, a large part of the original museum was a collection of various libraries, it had a horror of using gas lighting because they were really worried about the collection catching fire, papers catching fire, and there being an inflagration. Although interestingly, there were, as I mentioned, open fires as the main source of heating. It was one of the pioneers of electrical lighting, and it was first switched on in the reading room in 1879. But before that, there was no lighting. So basically, the museum had to shut as soon as it got too dark to see. And you'll all remember the stories about London's smogs when you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The museum also had to close on the day when there was a thick smog because people just couldn't see what they were doing. So as I say, we were one of the pioneers of electrical lighting, and swan lamps, which were closed light bulbs, were introduced to the reading room in February 1880 at the cost of 25 shillings each. Now, I'm not quite sure what that is in today's money, but quite a lot of money. And 2 were immediately stolen. And so what they did was they moved the lights to higher up so that the public couldn't actually reach the lamps and steal them. And by 1890, the museum was completely lit by electricity. And in fact, it generated its own electricity until 1935. I'm now going to talk about toilets, and we'll get a little bit earthy at points, so bear with me. And if it offends you, avert your ears for a couple of minutes. So the first thing to say about toilets is there were none for the public until 1840. They were only provided for the male curatorial staff because, of course, there were no women working in the museum at that point. But this apparently wasn't a problem because it was apparently perfectly acceptable for people to urinate in public, both men and women. However, this became less acceptable over time, and men were okay because they could use public houses, but it was not considered proper for women to go into these places. So it's quite interesting that it's acceptable to urinate in public, but not to go into a public house, but nevertheless. So as you can imagine, this wasn't very nice for the people who lived there, because at that time, the curatorial staff actually lived on the premises. So Edward Hawkins, who was the keeper of antiquities, complained to the trustees that every person calling at his door is liable to witness indecencies and sure to be offended by unpleasant smells, which are frequently perceived even within the house. In 1842, a trustee raised the possibility of a women's toilet, but Smirke, the architect, if you remember, said this would be objectionable. He suggested converting a storeroom in the Greek and Townley department. Townley was another benefactor of the museum, but the keeper objected on the grounds of delicacy. Now, there's a nice coda to this, because in 2009, there was a letter to the Guardian. Those of you who read the Guardian will know that it often has correspondence about quirky things, and it had an ongoing correspondence about Izal toilet paper. And I'm older people will remember Izal toilet paper, very hard. And this letter was from Anne-Marie Lequesne, who says, as an American postgraduate student in the 1970s, I first encountered Izal toilet paper in the ladies' toilet at the British Museum reading room. Each square had a royal crest saying it was the property of Her Majesty the Queen, which I think is really nice. Okay, so some interesting things about the museum which you may or may not know. First of all, there was once a cabinet of obscene objects, pornography basically, which could only be viewed on application by gentlemen and, interestingly, by clergymen. It was held in this room here in the picture, which is the arched room, which is a very beautiful room, and which, unfortunately, as members of the public, you're unlikely ever to go in to, unless you're interested in clay tablets covered in cuneiform, because this is where the collection of about 100,000 clay tablets is held. There are also disguised doors and a special logo for firefighters. Now, if you remember, a couple of years ago, there was, or was it last year, there was the fire at Notre Dame. And if you remember, people were able to save the greatest treasures. So the museum has worked with the London Fire Brigade, and we have identified our greatest treasures. And there's a special logo on the door of every room that holds one of those treasures. So the firefighters know if there is a fire in the museum, those are the places to go to first, and those are the things they will rescue before anything else. The museum had its own underground station between 1900 and 1933, and part of the collection was hidden in the Aldwych underground station during World War II to keep it safe from the bombs. And there was a ghost, which appeared on June the 3rd, 1997, when the last book was taken out of the museum to the British Library. Nowadays, of course, the museum works a lot with the public, and we're very committed to engaging people, and particularly young people. Here's a very nice picture of an installation which was done by the Mary Ward Centre, which is an adult education centre in Bloomsbury. This was linked to an exhibition on Islamic art. However, it has to be said that this was not always the case. I mentioned that initially admission, you had to get a ticket to be admitted, and you could only get a ticket if you had a decent appearance. After the French Revolution, there was a concern that people might loot aristocratic and church property, so guards were stationed on the doors of the museum. And then sometime after, railings were erected to keep the nuisances away from the museum in Great Russell Street. The King's Library was opened in 1831, but not to the general public, because that's the King's Library I mentioned was the room that was built to house the Library of King George III. And the principal librarian was mentioned that, or said, people of a higher grade would hardly wish to come to the museum at the same time as sailors from the dockyards and the girls whom they may bring with them. When you go into the main entrance of the museum, there is a drinking fountain on either side of the door. And again, the keeper of the manuscripts was very concerned when these were erected. He said, let the public drink, but surely not at the immediate entrance, where a dirty mess is sure to be made. And there seemed to be a particular problem about women. The Times, for example, complained that women revealed the colour of their stockings when reaching for the books in the library. And it was felt that the presence of beautiful young women was a disturbance to serious study. The implication was, in a lot of the discussion, that the only reason that women went to the reading room was looking for a husband. And it was seriously suggested, although never actually implemented, that reading and study rooms should be sex segregated. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that I was going to just touch on some of the less well-known areas in the museum, and I'm just going to whiz you through what has been described as the biggest loft conversion in London. So this is the back of the museum at the Montague Square entrance, right at the top of the building, and there are some absolutely wonderful treasures there. So if you've never been there, do find your way there. Up there you will find the Japanese galleries. Here we've got a beautiful example of ceramic work. and also the Percival David collection of Chinese ceramics, which has thousands of pieces which cover different periods, different styles, different colours. Wonderful collection. Also the Korean Gallery, where you will find this lovely 18th century moon jar. This was made in Korea, bought by Bernard Leach, the potter, and he then gave it to Lucy Ree, and it was bought by the museum when it was put up for sale. And there's a nice little story here, because this was seen by a potter, Adam Buick, and once he saw this moon jar, he decided that that was all he was ever going to make from now on. And you can actually buy his moon jars. They're really beautiful objects. And on the right, we have some cloths which are made by women, and these are used to wrap gifts in Korea. Also up on the top floor at the rear of the museum, you will find the Department of Prints and Drawings. This is the National Collection of Prints and Drawings. And as a member of the public, you are entitled to see anything in this collection. You can contact the museum and ask to see a Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo drawing. And if the room is not too busy, they will get it out for you to have a look at. In 2013, the World Conservation and Exhibition Centre opened at the back of the museum, the rear part of the museum. And I'm going to talk about some of the work of this centre in conjunction with a discussion of the newest gallery, the Albukhary Gallery of the Islamic world, which opened in 2018. Now, I mentioned at the beginning that ideas about museums change, and the old curatorial style of just sticking everything in a case with a label next to it is no longer considered sufficient. Nowadays, it's felt to be very important to tell a story. So at the beginning of planning this gallery, which took about 4 years to bring to fruition, there was a lot of discussion about what was the story that we want to tell through this gallery. And the conclusion was that we wanted, or the museum wanted this gallery to focus on material culture from the Islamic world. And that included everyday objects as well as high art. The museum wanted the gallery to cover a very wide geographical and historical spread. So it goes back to the very earliest days of Islam, right up to the present day with newly commissioned work. And it covers an area from Western Europe through to Southeast Asia. We have a very large collection of objects from the Islamic world. So the next decision is, what are you going to actually display? How are you going to display it? And how are you going to arrange it so as best to attract the attention of the visitor? During the process of development, the museum built mock display cases and literally used cardboard cutouts of objects to play around with them so that they could try different ways of displaying the objects without actually risking any damage to them. And I was very fortunate to be able to go and see a couple of these mock-ups. It was really interesting to see the process of how they went about that. Our visitor research shows that most people spend about 2 hours in the museum and spend approximately 40 seconds looking at each object. And those of you who've been to the museum will know there's so much in there, it can be completely overwhelming. So the question is, how can you attract people's attention and guide them through a gallery? And it was decided to use what are called gateway objects. And these are special objects, and they're arranged in, let me see if I can see, no, you can't see it on that picture. Gateway objects, and they're put in a sort of area of their own with an explanation around them. And the idea is they then lead the visitor through the other objects in the case. And this is a mosque lamp, which is Iznik. It was made in Turkey in 1549, although it was actually comes from the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. And an interesting part of the story behind this lamp is that it was donated by Charles Fortnum, who was one of the founders of Fortnum and Mason. When developing the gallery, the conservationists had to do a risk assessment of every single object against this checklist. I won't read through them all because that would be tedious, but you can see there's a number of things that you have to consider. And for example, if we look at these bath clogs, which come from Turkey, they're made in the 19th century. They are made partly from wood. And so it's very important when they're displayed that the temperature and the humidity is correct so that the wood doesn't begin to dry out and to warp and so on. If you look in glass cases in the museum, you'll often see there are temperature gauges, humidity gauges, and so on. These clogs were made to be worn by a woman in the hammam in the Turkish bath. And they're 26 centimeters high. So absolutely impossible to walk on unaided. The woman would have to have an attendant on either side of her. So what this tells you is that anyone who owned these clogs was actually very wealthy. And again, there's an interesting story behind the donor of these. These were part of about 300 objects which were donated to the museum by Henry Christie. And he made many visits to Turkey. And on one of those visits, he came across looped towels. And when he returned to England, he had a manufacturing business. He started to manufacture these looped towels. And some of you may well have heard of Christie's towels, which are very famous. In the World Conservation and Exhibition Centre, as well as conservators, we also have scientists. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of their work by looking at some objects of Islamic metalwork. The first is the Herat pitcher. And this was made between 1180 and 1200 in Herat, which is in current day, modern day Afghanistan. When looking at metal objects, scientists can look at their composition. This object is made from inlaid brass. Brass is an alloy of copper and zinc, and their analysis has shown this is very, very high quality. So it's only about 19 to 20% zinc and the rest of it is copper. Metal analysis can also tell you the origin of the raw materials, and it can also tell you something about the technique that was actually used to make the objects. Now, you can see on this object around the neck of the body, around the top of the body, there are these little birds, and here you've got a lion. And these are made using the what's called the repousse technique, where you push the shape out from inside the jug. So very, very, very delicate process. The pitcher is about 40 centimeters high. And so these little birds are just a couple of centimeters. They're absolutely tiny. And yet you can see the amount of detail in the work. The brass is inlaid with copper and with silver, and that was done by making grooves in the brass and inlaid. And another example is the Blacas Ewer. This was made in Mosul in Iraq in 1232. And Mosul at that time was a centre for high art, particularly metalwork and the art of the book. These little roundels, which you can see here, they're around the main body of the ewer. It's about 30 centimeters high. And these are probably 5 centimeters, 6 centimeters high. So you could imagine that all of the detail there is inlaid, and imagine how long it would take to make it. Here you can see one of our scientists X-raying the ewer. Some of these scenes come from the Shamane, the Persian Book of Kings, and that tells the story of the Persian kings, and it was written in the year 1000. Any of you who saw Samira Ahmed's series, The Art of Persia, on the BBC recently will know that she made frequent references to the Shamane. Here you've got a lady holding up her mirror with her servant. You can tell it's her servant because the servant is smaller than the woman, which means that she is of lower status than the lady. Here you've got a couple of musicians. Here you've got a lady on a camel in her howdah, again the servant behind her, smaller. And here you've got a hunter out on his horse hunting with his pet cheetah on the back. And the final piece of metalwork that I want to mention is this 13th century astrolabe, and this is a scientific instrument. This was used to tell the time, to work out directions. So this is particularly useful for Muslims because they can work out where Mecca is and therefore the direction they need to face when they pray. It's got the signs of the zodiac on the back, and each of these pointers here points to a different star or planet. This is very unusual astrolabe because the pointers have figures and animals at the end of them, and that's very, very unusual. We had astrolabes in Britain, and in fact Geoffrey Chaucer, the poet, actually wrote an instruction booklet on how to use an astrolabe, and we have his astrolabe in the British Museum. Here we have a jade terrapin. This comes from Mughal India, and this was made in the 17th century. And this weighs about 40 kilos, and it's made from a single block of jade. And the issue for our scientists here was to work out what this object is and also where the jade came from. It's very, very accurately carved, and scientists at the Natural History Museum were able to say from this carving that this is the female, and I'm told you can tell this by the shell, of a species called Kashoga dongaka, which lives in the river Yamuna, where it meets the river Ganges. This was found in a palace in Allahabad in 1803, so we don't know when it was made. But our scientists think, and our historians think, that it was made during the time of Crown Prince Selim, who became the Emperor Jahangir, because he was known to patronize jade carvers, and also he loved natural history. And it's thought that this was made as a garden ornament for him. Now, I'm going to finish with a couple of my favorite objects, all of which come from ancient Iraq. I love this on the left, this clay sickle. In ancient Iraq, clay was the most available material for building and for making objects. And people used to make sickles out of clay, which sounds impossible. It sounds as if they wouldn't work. But the advantage was there was so much clay around, if you broke one, you simply made another one, and then you put it out in the sun to dry, and then you could use it in a couple of days. As you can see, it's up to 8,000 years old. Here we have the flood tablet, which tells the story of the flood from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which has many similarities with the story of Noah's flood. But I'm going to end with this cuneiform tablet, which is almost 4,000 years old. And this tablet contains what is the oldest known consumer complaint in history. And it's from Nanni to his copper merchant, Ea-Nası. And basically Nanni is complaining about the quality of the goods that the merchant has provided for him. So he says, when you came, you said to me as follows, I will give Gimel Sid, when he comes, fine quality copper ingots. But you He didn't do this. He gave him substandard products and basically said, you can take them or leave them. So Nanni says, from now on, I will not accept here any copper from you that is not of fine quality. I shall from now on select and take the ingots individually in my own yard, and I shall exercise against you my right of rejection because you have treated me with contempt. So I don't know if it's comforting or depressing to know that 4,000 years ago, merchants were still trying, or were trying to pull a fast one on their customers. That's the end of my talk. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much indeed for listening to me. And I hope that when things return to normal, this will inspire you to go back to the museum and to explore some of our great treasures. Thank you very much indeed.